me, why do I have a particular interest in Hong Kong? I was back, what feels like a very long time ago now. I spent 4 or 5 years in Bangkok, a couple of years of which I worked for the Bangkok Post, and I actually managed its coverage of the handover Hong Kong. And I've been was very troubled then and since about the use of the word handover when we're talking about people. So that's me. Our next speaker up, I'm going to refer to as Zelda. They will appear on the screen as SS. I don't think I really need to provide any explanation as to why we're taking those precautions, why those precautions need to be taken. I'm rather assuming that pretty well everyone on this call is well aware of what's happening in Hong Kong, so I won't take any time talking about that. What I will perhaps take is just take a moment, because I think take a moment to think about the people in Hong Kong who are so bravely standing up for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. So I think, for a moment, we can just think of all the people and all the difficulty, the fearful situation, the circumstances they're in, and just perhaps take a moment to think about where they're at and think of all of them as individual people with their lives. So just to take a moment for that. Thank you. So I'm going to hand over now to Zelda from Stand With Hong Kong to speak out, to explain what Stand With Hong Kong is and why it believes that Magnitsky-style sanctions are important in this context. Over to you, Zelda.
Thank you, Baroness Bennett. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Just a little bit about Fight for Freedom, Stand With Hong Kong. We are a completely independent, grassroots, crowdfund initiated group of individuals who's come together to fight for freedom and democracy for Hong Kong. We are from different walks of life. We're not politicians. We don't have experience before all of this. And like our fellow Hong Kongers on the street, we've just rised up for the call for democracy, basically. In the past 22 years, we've witnessed China's erosion of our fundamental freedoms, human rights, and rule of law. And the conduct's just been in breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which is a legally binding treaty, and it also formed the basis of the 1992 US Hong Kong Policy Act, which is why we are so shocked and heartbroken at the deterioration, frankly, of what's been happening in the past year since the protest about the extradition law, and now to the deterioration until most recently, the national security law in June. To why we think Magnitsky-style sanctions are important, quite frankly, is because it's a source of accountability. So despite very well documented police brutality, of videos, of newspaper, of indiscriminate use of force against Hong Kongers, senior police officials have still repeatedly ruled out a full independent inquiry into their tactics towards pro-democracy demonstrators, to their lack of deployment on the 21st of July 2019, and various other events afterwards. I'm sure those present are well aware of the APPG's report on the inquiry of the possible human rights abuses of the humanitarian and medical workers. And just from that damning report, we've seen how bad the situation has been. And it's frankly just something that should not be allowed in an international city such as Hong Kong. However, despite the nature and levels of violence displayed by the Hong Kong police force, despite that breaking national and international law, well documented, there's still no way for us to hold them accountable. Previously, there was an attempt for some foreign experts overseeing an investigation into allegations of excessive force used by the Hong Kong police force, but the whole panel stepped down in December 2019 after discussing with the Independent Police Complaints Council, and that them realizing that that will result in any agreed process through the Independent Police Complaints Council would be able to conduct an effective and truly independent investigation. So this brings us to now. We think that Hong Kong is an international city, and an international city deserves international attention. An environment where police and officials can use violence against those wishing to promote democratic freedoms is intolerable. So there needs to be clear consequences for these actions. And that's why South Hong Kong is here, and we're proud to co-host this, to listen to experts of this matter and to truly call for actual concrete actions that will hold these brutal police tactics accountable. Thank you.
Classic unmuting mistake. Thank you very much, Zelda, for that very clear outline of the situation. And I think it's probably also just worth mentioning that probably most people are already aware of this, but the UK has a special responsibility as the signatory with China to the joint declaration. And I would uphold, and many people would uphold, many lawyers uphold the special responsibility of the UK in the situation in Hong Kong. But we want to focus tonight particularly on the issue of Magnitsky sanctions. And I'm going to do that classic chair thing of saying our main speaker needs no introduction and then introduce them. But our main speaker is, of course, Bill Browder, who really is the man behind the whole Magnitsky sanctions, which started in the US in 2012 and have since been adopted, taken up around the world, including in the UK. It's probably a couple of months ago now that we had the government making its first announcements of targets for that. And what I'm going to do is ask Bill in about 20 minutes or so to outline the story briefly, but particularly focusing on where it is now, what you think, Bill, that the UK and others should be doing in the particular context of Hong Kong. So over to you. Thanks, Bill.
Great. Well, great to be here. This is a really important, very important issue, and I'm glad to add my voice and hopefully some advice and context to this crisis, and perhaps bring some new ideas. So my name is Bill Browder. Maybe I'll tell you a little bit about how I ended up becoming the proponent of the Magnitsky Act, and tell you a little bit about Sergei Magnitsky, because it helps to understand where this story came from and where it's going. It starts in Russia. I went to Russia at the end of when the Soviet Union fell apart. I have an unusual family background. My grandfather was the leader of the American Communist Party, and so in my rebellion against my family, I became a capitalist. And when the Berlin Wall came down, I decided to try out capitalism right at the time that it was opening up over there. And I set up an investment business in Russia, and it eventually grew to become the largest investment fund in the country. I discovered in the companies that I was investing in that there was huge corruption. I mean, just corruption beyond imagination. And I decided that in order to try to run a decent business, I needed to challenge the corruption. And so I started to research how these oligarchs and senior government officials were stealing from the companies I was investing in. We would take that research and we would publish it in the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. And as you can imagine, it made a lot of people very unhappy. And after about 10 years of living there, In 2005, I was expelled from the country. I was declared a threat to national security. In 2007, my offices were raided in Moscow by 25 police officers. They seized all of our documents, and then they used those documents to steal our investment companies. And at that point, I hired a young lawyer named Sergei Magnitsky to investigate. Sergei investigated and discovered that the theft of our investment companies was just the first step in a highly complex fraud in which a bunch of government officials, police officers, and organized criminals worked together to steal $230 million of taxes that my firm had paid to the Russian government. Sergei, who was a young lawyer, incredibly idealistic, he thought that by exposing this crime, a crime against his own country, of the tax money being stolen, that he would be lauded for doing the right thing. Instead of rewarding him for being a good citizen, he was arrested. He was put in pretrial detention. He was then tortured to try to get him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left the lights on 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put him in cells with no heat and no window panes in December in Moscow, so he nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. They'd move him from cell to cell to cell. And all this, they wanted to get him to withdraw his testimony against these corrupt police officers, and they wanted to get him to sign a false confession to say that he stole the money. And he did so on my instruction. And he was a man of incredible principle and integrity. He refused to do that. In retaliation, the torture got worse and worse and worse. After about 6 months, he ended up developing terrible pains in his stomach. He was diagnosed as having pancreatitis and gallstones. He lost 20 kilos. He needed an operation, which was scheduled for the 1st of August, 2009. About a week before the operation, they came to him again, asked him again to sign a false confession. Again, he refused. In retaliation, they moved him to a maximum security prison where there was no medical facilities. At this maximum security prison, he received no medical treatment. There was no operation which had been scheduled. His health continued to deteriorate. He wrote 20 different desperate requests for medical attention to every different branch of the criminal justice system. Every request was ignored or denied. And on the night of November 16th, 2009, he went into critical condition. And on that night, the authorities at this maximum security prison didn't want to have responsibility for him anymore. They moved him to a different prison that had a hospital wing. But when he arrived there, instead of putting him in the emergency room, they put him in an isolation cell. They chained him to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat him until he died. That was November 16th, 2009, about 11 years ago. He left a wife and 2 children. And for me, I got the news the next morning, and it was by far the most horrifying, traumatic, life-changing news I could have ever gotten. He was effectively killed as my proxy. He'd still be alive today if he hadn't been working for me. And when I was finally able to get over the initial hysteria and fog of heartbreak to think clearly, I made a decision, which was that I was going to devote all of my time, all of my resources, and all of my energies to go after the people who killed him and make sure they face justice. And I've given up my life as a businessman, and for the last 11 years, I've gone after those people to make them face justice. And originally, I thought there was some possibility of getting justice in Russia because Sergei had documented everything that happened. He wrote 450 complaints during his 358 days in detention, documenting who did what to him, where, how, and when. And although he would take these complaints, handwritten complaints, give them to his lawyer once a month or once every 2 months. His lawyer would file them. The authorities would ignore them, but we got copies of all of them. And I thought that as a result, we have effectively the most well-documented case of human rights abuse that's ever come out of Russia. And because of that, I thought we could get some kind of justice in Russia. But it turned out that Putin got involved himself in this cover-up. They circled the wagons. Putin exonerated every single person who played a role in Sergei's false arrest, torture, and murder. The Russian government gave promotions and state honors to some of the people most complicit. And in the most shocking miscarriage of justice, they put Sergei Magnitsky on trial 3 years after they killed him in the first ever trial against a dead man in the history of Russia. It was pretty obvious long before this posthumous trial that there was no chance of getting justice inside of Russia. And so then I said to myself, how do we get justice outside of Russia? And I looked at all the legal mechanisms that exist in the world. I looked at the International Criminal Court and realized that you have to have 100,000 dead to get a case at the International Criminal Court. I looked at the European Court for Human Rights, which is a place in theory you should be able to get justice in Europe. And it turns out that they don't issue judgments against people, just against the country itself. Usually takes 10 years. And then the plaintiff, if they win, get 50,000 euros, and that's the end of the story. And then I looked at the concept of universal jurisdiction, and I discovered that it exists in theory, but it doesn't exist in practice. No countries ever prosecute under universal jurisdiction statutes. And so I was left with a situation, which is I was either going to have to accept that there was no possibility of getting justice for Sergei Magnitsky, which I couldn't, or I was going to have to come up with a new mechanism for justice. And that's when I started to think about what could we do to the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky, which would affect them? What kind of justice could we get? And I realized that the people who killed him for money. They killed him for $230 million of taxes that they stole and wanted to cover up. And they don't keep that money in Russia. They keep it in the West. They keep it in London, and they keep it in Geneva, and they keep it in New York, and they buy houses in the south of France, and they send their kids to boarding school in Switzerland, and they send their kids to Harvard and Columbia University and Oxford and Cambridge. And so I said to myself, we might not be able to get them for torture and murder in the West, but we can certainly touch them in a way that's very profound, which is to freeze their assets and ban their visas. And so I originally took this idea to Washington, and I presented the Sergei Magnitsky story, the same story I've just presented to you now, to two senators, a Democratic senator from Maryland named Benjamin Cardin, and a Republican senator from Arizona, John McCain. And I told them the story, and I said, can we ban their visas and freeze their assets? And they said, yes, we can, and we should. And that became the original idea for the Magnitsky Act in 2010. When they first drew up the law, it was a very narrow law, just going after the people who had killed Sergei Magnitsky. But as soon as they put that law on the proposed law book, all sorts of other victims from Russia started coming out of the woodwork and calling up these two senators and saying, you found the Achilles heel of the Putin regime. Can you possibly sanction the people who killed my brother, my husband, my father, my sister, my aunt? And after about a dozen of these calls, these two senators realized they're on something much bigger than just the Magnitsky case. They had sort of stumbled into a new technology for justice. And they added 65 words to the Magnitsky Act to not just go after the Magnitsky killers, but to go after all gross human rights abusers in Russia. And that then went to a vote in 2012, and there was effectively no politician could justify voting against it. And when it went for a vote, it passed the Senate 92-4. It passed the House of Representatives with 89%. And it became a federal law on December 14th, 2012. And it was very interesting. Right after it became a law, Putin just went out of his mind. He just lost his cool, which he rarely does. But he lost his cool because he's been in power primarily to steal money. He's killed, he's imprisoned, he's tortured, he's done all sorts of terrible things to people to take their money. And he values money more than human life, and he values keeping that money safe in the West. And all of a sudden, I've created this mechanism which puts his money at risk. And so he retaliated very strongly in a lot of different ways. First, against the US by banning the adoption of Russian orphans by American families, which is incredibly cruel because most of the orphans that were put up for adoption were disabled and sick orphans who, if adopted by American families, were brought into the medical system of America and nursed to health. And oftentimes in the orphanages in Russia, they would die. And so effectively, Putin was sentencing his own orphans to death in retaliation. He then made it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act in the United States and to prevent it from going to other countries. And some of you will remember that in 2016, Putin sent in one of his emissaries, a female lawyer named Natalia Veselnitskaya, to Trump Tower to meet with Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, and Paul Manafort shortly before the US election, before Trump was elected president, asking if Trump was elected president, would he repeal the Magnitsky Act in exchange for information on Hillary Clinton? I'm happy to say that none of Putin's efforts to repeal the Magnitsky Act had any effect, and in fact, just the opposite. These two senators said, well, wait a second, if Putin is so upset about this, we should use this same tool on other dictators who should be equally upset about this. And that was the genesis of the global Magnitsky Act. So the first Magnitsky Act just applied to Russia, but the global Magnitsky Act was introduced, and in 2016, at the end of 2016, it was voted into law in the United States. On the same day that the global Magnitsky Act was voted into law, the Estonian government voted unanimously, or the Estonian parliament voted unanimously for an Estonian Magnitsky Act. About 6 months later, the Canadian parliament in both houses voted unanimously for a Canadian Magnitsky Act, followed by a Lithuanian Magnitsky Act, followed by a Latvian Magnitsky Act, followed by a UK Magnitsky Act. In 2018, the UK created the Magnitsky Amendment to the sanctions law. And I'm proud to say that on July 6th of this year, the Magnitsky Act was put into force. There are still some problems with the UK Magnitsky Act. Unlike the US Magnitsky Act and the Canadian Magnitsky Act, the UK Magnitsky Act only applies to human rights abusers. It doesn't apply to corruption and kleptocrats. And because the world is so, corruption and human rights abuse are so intertwined, I find that to be a very serious deficiency. Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, who was actually my main partner in Parliament when he was on the back bench to do the Magnitsky Act, has promised me and promised everybody publicly that corruption will be part of the UK Magnitsky Act. But this is a serious deficiency, and it requires outside pressure from parliamentarians and from civil society to make sure that this commitment gets fulfilled in a world where there's a lot of other things on the government's mind. Similarly, there's a deficiency in the UK Magnitsky Act compared to the US, in that in the US, Congress has a say in who gets put on the Magnitsky list. And what I mean by that is government ultimately makes the final decision, but in the US, there's actually a mechanism in which it's called the congressional trigger, where the chairman and ranking members of different committees can propose names to be sanctioned. And then it's the duty of the State Department to report within 120 days whether those people have been sanctioned or not, and if not, why. At the moment in the UK, we don't have such a parliamentary oversight provision, and I believe that that's necessary. Let me just finish off by saying something really important, and this coming back to Hong Kong. I've watched these atrocities in Hong Kong, and as everybody has, and it's infuriating, and we all feel powerless, but we really aren't powerless here, because the Magnitsky Act is something which would very effectively sting the people involved in all of this crushing of peaceful demonstration, crushing of free speech, crushing of free expression. And the Magnitsky Act really does create a problem for the people who are sanctioned, and it creates fear for everybody else who isn't sanctioned. If you get added to the Magnitsky list, you effectively become a non-person in the world of money, finance, business, banking. banks will all close your accounts. All banks subscribe to one of several database services that monitor all sanctions lists around the world. Anyone who ever gets added to a sanctions list all of a sudden can't do any more banking. It's very difficult to do business with international companies because nobody wants to be in violation of sanctions. It's very difficult for these people to get visas, not just for the countries that are sanctioning them, but for other countries, because when the people in the consular departments of countries look up the people who are asking for visas, they say, well, that person's on a sanctions list for human rights abuse. We're not going to let them into our country. And in addition to the people who are being sanctioned who feel these consequences, it creates a fear among everybody who's being asked to do terrible things that they might eventually be sanctioned themselves. And so it takes away some of the power that dictators have to control their law enforcement mechanisms, because the people in law enforcement might say, you know, I'm just not going to do that stuff because I don't know how long the dictator is going to last, and I don't know what's going to happen to me, but I don't want to end up permanently being stuck in my own country and not being able to travel, not being able to spend the ill-gotten gains I have, etc. And so this is a real serious tool, and it slightly levels the playing field. You know, the dictators used to have 100% of the power. Maybe now they have 99 and we have 1 with the Magnitsky Act. And if it starts getting used more prominently, maybe it goes from 99-1 to 90-10. But it's a step definitely in the right direction and something which should be used. And I can't think of a more appropriate case right now than the people in the Hong Kong regime who are doing all this terrible stuff. I think I'll leave it at that, and happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. And I guess I want to say, I think on behalf of everyone on this call and in the whole world, thank you for everything you've done and for making this something I know lots of people who campaign on issues, but you've dedicated yourself to this and made a huge amount of progress. So thank you for that. I think that should be said.
Thank you.
And I think we're going to focus on Hong Kong tonight, but I was just thinking about some of the situation that, of course, I talked about the UK having particular responsibility in terms of Hong Kong and the colonial history. But the UK, of course, also has a special responsibility if we look at what came out from the Panama Papers of the UK and the City of London and British territories being, an absolute total haven for dirty money, for corrupt money from around the world. And, some figures on that. These numbers just get so large, they just sound like numbers, but there's thought to be 21 trillion pounds of dirty money swashing around the world. 390 billion come out of Russia since the wall came down, and about 35 billion in London. So, this is an issue that we as Britons, have lots of reasons to be very interested in and very concerned about. Just a reminder that anyone who's on the Jitsi call, if you want to ask a question, you can type that into the chat box, or for parliamentarians or press, if you want to type your desire to ask a question, we can put you up on the screen to ask. And people who are watching on the YouTube channel, if you want to put questions there, we'll do our best to also pick up questions from there and put them to Bill. But to start off with, thinking about Magnitsky sanctions in the UK and Hong Kong, what's your feeling? Or you're obviously having contact, you've got good contacts with the British government. What can we do? How close are we? What's your framework of the understanding of, I've been in Parliament myself facing ministers across at least the virtual dispatch box, and they keep saying, yes, we're going to do something, but what's your feeling about where we're at in progress in this area?
Well, as you say, Britain has a special responsibility for Hong Kong. And so, the government can't turn a blind eye, and they haven't turned a blind eye. I mean, I think the noises that I've heard, and I don't have any special insight that I can share, but the noises that I've heard would suggest that there is a appetite to use the Magnitsky sanctions on Hong Kong. And the good thing about having the Magnitsky Act in a number of different countries is that Britain doesn't have to single itself out for Chinese retaliation. The US has already sanctioned some Hong Kong officials. Britain can join the US. They could maybe do so at the same time as as the Canadians and various other countries. But this country has a duty based on history to do something here. And if I listen to the noises in Parliament, I mean, there's, it's a fever pitch to do something. And I would say that the government probably has an appetite to do something as well. The problem that we have right now is that with COVID, with Brexit, with all these other things, there's just so much stuff, occupying the bandwidth of the Prime Minister, of the Foreign Secretary, and so on, that it's just hard to, I think it's just hard to get stuff done, and the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and it's important for everybody who cares about this issue to keep on making noise about it until the government does something. You're muted.
Oh, okay, sorry. I tried to click mute, but it didn't register. Unmute, but didn't register. Following on from that, from what you've seen in other countries, from what you know about the UK, what's the best tactics to use to really put pressure on governments? I mean, obviously the US is a bit different, where Congress has the power that everyone can kind of directly lobby their congressperson, who can then, actually take action directly. But we can still, of course, do that in the UK to put pressure on. And one of the things that's really noticeable about the APPG in Hong Kong, I mean, by definition, all-party parliamentary groups have to be cross-party, have to have a very broad representation. But I think we probably have a broader and deeper representation across all the parties than most APPGs do. But what do you think NGOs and individuals, what's the best approaches for them to take to really put the pressure on the government?
Well, what I've always found works well is shame. Why is the United States sanctioned on the Magnitsky list a number of Hong Kong officials, and Britain, who has a much greater responsibility in Hong Kong, not? And I think that generally, governments do things sometimes out of inspiration, but most of the time they do things out of trying to avoid political or moral fallout. And this is an issue that I don't think anybody who watches TV doesn't seeing these terrible beatings of innocent people on the street, and these arrests and all this kind of stuff. I don't think anyone can watch this and say nothing should be done. And so if the government isn't going to do it out of inspiration, then they should do it out of defensiveness and shame.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, one of the things I see is a huge amount of discussion, and obviously I get copied into it, but on social media, and you see terrible pieces of video. There was that arrest of the 12-year-old girl a week or so back. And I think sometimes people feel like they're sharing it, they're putting the news out in social media. But I would suggest, make sure you share that with your MP, share that with members of the House of Lords you might happen to know, use that as well, not just sharing it publicly, but also make sure it's coming directly to politicians. And just, I've got one question in the chat box, just a reminder to everybody that you can put questions in now. We are going to finish right on the dot of 9, because I try and keep these things to the advertised time. And I know what usually happens is there's usually a great rush of questions coming in right at the end. So please people do get in early, because that's the way your question will get asked. So I've got a question here from Elle. Do you think sanctions are the best way to affect the authorities? I'm just reading the question out here. Personally, I reckon that starting the war of justice might be the best way to stop a large-scale human rights suppression. So I guess I think this is being taken, sanctions is being taken as part of a war in fighting for justice. So is this the best way to stop the best target we've got, really?
So here, we have to live in, we all live in a real world here, and the historic way in which governments dealt with situations with other governments that did terrible things, like what's happening in Hong Kong right now, is if something was really terrible, let's say apartheid in South Africa, then a government could apply sanctions to the country. But that's a really, really hard thing to get any government to do. I mean, it's to stop trading with a country, to stop diplomacy with a country. I mean, the bar is so incredibly high, and particularly when it comes to China, where everybody is totally economically dependent, and China is very important diplomatically in terms of all international conversations. Therefore, and most importantly, if you do that, which is almost impossible to do and very unlikely, if you're ever able to do that, who suffers? The regular people, the victims of the dictatorship, not the dictators themselves, not the regime, but the bad guys will fly in plane loads of caviar and champagne for themselves while the regular people are starving. So that's kind of a dysfunctional thing all the way around. It's hard to do, and it targets the wrong people. The beauty of the Magnitsky Act and the Magnitsky sanctions is it turns the whole thing on its head, and it says, let's leave everybody else alone. Let's just target the specific people who are doing the specific bad deeds. And most importantly, we can carry on trading with China. We can carry on having diplomacy with China and just go after these individuals. And the individuals hate it more than anything because they're getting singled out while everybody else is getting left alone. And just judging, now, this is all relatively new for China. They've only had a few people sanctioned just by the United States so far. The Russians have had a lot more experience with this, and they hate it. They just hate it with all their heart. And the Chinese regime is very similar to the Russian regime, not quite as kleptocratic, but pretty kleptocratic. And these people all have money all over the world and so on and so forth. And they love to travel. And all of a sudden you take that away from them, and that does alter behavior, and it does make them feel like they're no longer untouchable. And that feeling of vulnerability, that feeling that something that's totally outside their control, which could really harm them, is a very powerful tool. And I think that as it gets used more, as Britain eventually starts using this more liberally, and this is a country where people really like to come to, I think it will have some effect.
Thank you. Yes, and it's interesting that the Chinese ambassador, I think came out this morning, was an interview talking about sort of taking a preemptive swing at Britain, saying, "Oh, don't do nasty things to us," which is a very interesting sign. I think we have Lord Barclay on this call, and I think I'm not quite sure where the message came from, but I think you'd like to ask a question, Michael. So if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask a question, that would be great.
He's not unmuted. You're not unmuted.
It's bottom right of my screen anyway.
How is that?
That's better.
How is that?
We can hear you now.
Oh, great. Bill, I thought your book was extraordinary, and not just extraordinary in terms of what it revealed, but in terms of emotions, profoundly moving. And what I'd really like to ask you is, what kind of differences do you think? I mean, you got to know the whole Russian system so well. And I wonder whether there are any quite important things that we should be aware of as parliamentarians, which differentiate Russia and China as far as the Magnitsky Act would be concerned.
Well, I mean, so Russia is probably, the key to the effectiveness of the Magnitsky Act is how much money these people have outside of the country. So the Russians completely don't trust their own country to keep their money. Everybody is just stealing from everybody constantly. Because
they might steal from themselves.
Well, so, as easily as they stole it, it can get stolen from them. China, I believe, and I'm not an expert on China, I'm just looking at it from a distance. China is not quite as it's not quite as crazy a place as Russia is in terms of money. So they may not have, the Russians will literally keep 100% of their money outside the country. And so the key question is, for the people who matter in China, how much of their money do they keep outside of the country? Because that's what will determine how bad they get hit by this and how bad they feel. from what I can tell, every Chinese crooked official likes to have something outside the country because that's their bolt hole. That's their, they'll pick up an extra passport from Canada or the UK or whatever, and they'll own a property that they can go to. But I don't know the proportions, and that's the key, because the proportions then determine how stung they are. But even if they don't have 90% of their money out, or even 50%, the other thing which is really important is the naming and shaming aspect of this whole thing. That when you get put on a human rights sanctions list, that's it. I mean, it's a really terrible, terrible thing. And you will be, every time you ever make a statement, do anything publicly, your bio is going to say, so-and-so, this, that, and the other thing position, and on the UK Magnitsky list. And that's not a good place to be. It's and I guess the final thing I would say is that none of these dictatorships ever last forever. It all looks so like set in stone. And it's I'm not an expert on China to know what the future is there, but a lot of people in these regimes don't think that their dictatorship is going to last forever, and they kind of have an exit plan. They've done a lot of terrible things, and when it all falls, they're going to go somewhere else. And this completely ruins their exit plan. When they exit and try to apply for asylum somewhere else when a new government comes in or a new regime, nobody's going to take them. That may not apply to China, but it certainly applies to a lot of other dictatorships around the world.
Yeah, and I think, that's an interesting case study when you think about where some of the British sanctions have been applied to Saudi Arabia, and particularly the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And there's a regime which doesn't always look very stable. And I think it's hard to tell if you look at Chinese history. I have a little background in Chinese history, and the whole idea of the mandate of heaven. If you look at sort of medieval and ancient Chinese compared to European, oddly enough, the mandate of heaven means it's actually easier to change regimes than it was under the divine right of kings in Europe. Some interesting history there. We've got a really interesting question coming in from Andrew Fox via YouTube. Has anyone targeted by the legislation around the world been able to legally challenge it in the courts? And what sort of process is being taken for people to be put on the sanctions list in the first place?
So when the Magnitsky Act was created in all countries, due process was a key feature. And in every country, and particularly in the UK, there is the opportunity to challenge it if it's not right. If the person didn't do the crimes that they're accused of, or there's some other violation of due process. There are so many candidates to be sanctioned. There's so many atrocities in so many different countries that the number of people who've been sanctioned so far have been very, very small. I think in the US it's about 200 people so far. And at this stage of the game, there's been so much what I call low-hanging fruit. And what that means is just clear, obvious, just unbelievably bad people, where the evidence is overwhelming, that there's been no tough cases. There's been no sort of cases where it's on one hand and on the other. I mean, I would argue that it's really hard to get people on the sanctions list because the U.S. government and other governments are being so careful about not doing anything that's where they could be challenged and overturned. And so there has not been a single challenge that's succeeded. I don't think there's actually been a challenge yet on the Magnitsky Act anywhere in the world, and certainly none that have succeeded.
Another question coming in via YouTube. Do you think the UK sanctions regulation is wide enough to cover Hong Kong? I think I've got my own thoughts on this, but I'll go to you, Bill.
100%. There's no question. And the people that the UK Magnitsky Act covers human rights abuse, atrocities, torture, all the stuff that they're doing in Hong Kong. No question at all.
Yeah, I think that the question might be, when we're looking in the broader context of the UK, is widening it out to cover corruption and situations where we see people stealing huge amounts of money, from their people in countries around the world, that effectively robs their people of education, of medical care, etc. And that's where I think people would really like to see the law broadened, and we have some suggestions from the government that they will. This is always a good question to ask, I think, generally as a matter of principle, about almost any proposal. Are there any potential dangers of opposing Magnitsky-style sanctions, so that we can be aware of them? I'm going to ask that question both in the context of Hong Kong specifically. What are the risks of doing this in Hong Kong, and perhaps also more generally, if you've seen in other contexts?
Well, the main risk, of course, is the obvious one, which is that China will asymmetrically retaliate and attack the UK in terms of trade at a moment of COVID economic weakness, and at a time of Brexit economic weakness. And so I believe that the Chinese are fully aware of that hammer, and that's what they have to fight back with. I mean, it's interesting when the U.S. sanctioned 12 Hong Kong officials, the Chinese retaliated by sanctioning 9 U.S. senators, and then maybe 8 U.S. senators and 3 or 4 heads of human rights organizations. My friend Mike Abramowitz from Freedom House was sanctioned. Ken Roth from Human Rights Watch. Carl Gershman from the another big human rights organization were all sanctioned. But the interesting thing is it's totally not a symmetrical tool, because it's one thing for Chinese people to want to come to America. It's another thing for American people to want to go to China. It's not symmetrical. Nobody I know wants to keep their money in Chinese banks, and so they can't use that. But the tool that they can use is this vicious economic retaliation. Now, having said that, they've got to be careful, because the world is pretty upset with China right now. It's not just the UK, it's not just the US, it's not just Canada, it's not just the EU, it's not just Australia. Everybody's upset. And if they start lashing out at everybody economically, they might ruin all of their markets. And so the key to this, to the extent that it's possible, is to do these sanctions in concert. And so you don't end up in a situation where they can pick anyone out. And but China is the toughest case. It's the hardest case of any country because of their economic power, no question.
In terms of that coordination, I mean, Russia seems to be, or was the first area where this was done. Was there kind of real coordination in around the world as countries came on board with having the legal framework? Did you see real coordination against Russia or other countries?
Well, because the Magnitsky case was what drove the Magnitsky Act in a number of countries, every country that has Magnitsky Acts has sanctioned the Magnitsky killers. But beyond that, there hasn't been much coordination. And my hope is that as time goes on, this becomes sort of a harmonized process, that there's like a Magnitsky department in all foreign ministries that coordinate with each other. But at the same time, one doesn't want to be hamstrung by coordination. One doesn't want to be in one of these United Nations situations where nothing happens because everybody is waiting for everyone else to do stuff. That would be a disaster if it became to that. But it does help if there's like a particularly shocking atrocity and everyone can act in concert. That's a nice thing to do. Yeah,
and you don't want a Security Council veto being able to be applied in that kind of context.
Exactly.
So just coming back to that sort of potential Chinese retaliation, I suppose in the obvious context of Hong Kong, and we're focused on Hong Kong tonight, but we also have to think about what's happening with the Uyghur people.
Yes.
We've got to focus, but we can't forget that either. I suppose one of the fears, one of the risks might be that retaliation might be put against the people of Hong Kong, or indeed other people within China. It's the retaliation problem. I don't know what your thoughts might be about that.
Well, I don't think it's going to get. I don't think it's going to get worse for the people in China. It's pretty damn bad right now. I mean, what's going on is horrifying. I mean, 3 months ago, we could have this conversation, and the person from Hong Kong could show their face. I mean, the fact that we have an anonymous person talking about what's going on, and other people who have been on these forums getting arrested. And I mean, I don't see how it's going to get worse. I mean, it's already pretty damn bad, and I don't think that we're going to provoke. The only thing that prevents people from committing these atrocities is the fear of consequences, and we have a consequence, and we should absolutely use it as best as we can and as strong as we can, because otherwise the people of Hong Kong are sitting ducks. It's like 100-0. The dictatorship versus the people, and that's not right.
Okay, I'm just going to put out a final call and reminder. We've only got about 5 minutes left, so anyone who'd like to ask a question, whether you're on this Jitsi call or on YouTube, we'll try and pick it up if you've got time, but you've only got a minute or two to do that. So just a final call and a final reminder on that store, because we do try and make these things as democratic and open as we can possibly make them. So just looking forward, perhaps a year's time, 2 years' time, what would be your hope, both in terms of Hong Kong and perhaps more broadly? What are you seeing happening globally? Where's the next perspective? How far can things go in a year or two?
Well, so from the Magnitsky sanctions side, the biggest prize will be when the EU puts Magnitsky sanctions in place. Then you gain 27 countries. The EU made an announcement. Made an announcement yesterday. The Ursula von der Leyen made an announcement yesterday saying that they were going to move forward quickly on this, and she specifically mentioned Hong Kong and mentioned the Uyghurs, and so I could imagine. I predict that all of the major sort of civilized countries of the world will have a relatively robust Magnitsky sanctions list for Hong Kong by a year from now. I think these things happen frustratingly slowly, but they do happen, and there's absolutely the appetite here for sure. I think in the EU, I know there's more appetite in the US, and who's the best advocate for sanctioning Hong Kong officials and Chinese officials, but the Chinese themselves. I mean, every action that they take, every atrocity they commit, only hardens the resolve here in the West. And so, I predict that you'll have a lot of coordinated sanctions in time. But it doesn't feel very good right now. Well, everybody is being beaten defenseless on the street in Hong Kong.
Bill, you managed to find a paper trail to individuals in Russia. I think that might be more difficult in China, just the whole anonymity of it all.
Well, that's true. That's correct. It's hard generally to find out who's doing this stuff unless there's a unique situation like the one we were in. Having said that, we know who has got command responsibility for these crimes, and people who have command responsibility, who have ordered the crackdown on peaceful demonstrators, we know who they are. They make themselves known, and so I don't think it's a mystery who should be sanctioned. I think we can start with the same number of people that the U.S. has sanctioned recently, and then move on from there.
Yeah, and I think also, I mean, sometimes you if you can, you want to be able to identify particular actual crimes, but real responsibility, I think most people would agree, lies at the level of the person who directed the crime, rather than a relative lowly person who can then sort of be dismissed as a bad apple, which doesn't really address the underlying political issue.
Well, you kind of want to sanction everybody up and down the chain, because you want the junior people to be sanctioned, to know that if they take orders and that they can't just say it wasn't my fault, I was just following orders. And you want the senior people to be sanctioned, even though they say I wasn't wielding the baton. You can say, well, but you were the one who gave the order, and they were operating under your direction.
Okay, I think that's probably a nice, very rounded place to end it on, Bill, unless there's anything you think we haven't covered that you'd particularly like to add.
No, I think we've had a very good conversation. I'm always frustrated with these Zoom type calls because we can't all sort of congregate afterwards and get the real business done in the hallway. But it is what it is, and we'll just have to do what we can do. But thank you for giving me the opportunity to share the Magnitsky story and the virtue of these sanctions. And I hope that I can be helpful to the Hong Kong people in whatever way I can as this terrible situation unfolds.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for your time this evening. If there's anyone who's watching this really has some pressing kind of link they'd like to make after this, feel free to contact me. I'm very widely available on social media and everything, and I would certainly be able to try and put people in contact if that would be helpful. So that's something I very much like to do. So it only falls to me to do the final wrap up, which is where I look at my notes to make sure I'm doing all the bits I'm supposed to be doing. I think this has been a really productive, useful, and I've certainly learned a lot from this call, and I'm going to go away and see what bits I can do to put some more pressure on the government. And I hope, particularly the other members of the House of Lords on this call, we might be able to get together and see what we can do to do that, and also with MPs as well. I'd like to very much thank Stand With Hong Kong and Zelda for joining us this evening. I'd like to thank everybody who's joined us this evening. I'd like to thank our Secretariat for doing all the organisation that allows me to just come in and chair without having to worry about the technology, and it all worked, and that's always pretty nice. And if I missed the mute button once, that was me, not anybody else. So thank you very much, Bill. Thank you, everyone. And good night, and particularly to our viewers with or associated with Hong Kong, very best wishes and stay safe. Thank you.